I think before we get in the weeds, just for those who aren't familiar with your writing and commentary, we'd love to hear an overview answer to the marquee question of tonight's event. What do you think is the biggest problem you see in mainstream coverage of law and legal opinions?
Oh, shit. The biggest problem with legal journalism is that the president has not appointed me the czar of legal journalism with the unilateral authority to tell people what to write and how to do their work. I'm waiting on that call. I expect it to come any minute. I will not, like, as you say, this is one where like I could just talk for the next 45 minutes and we could call it a night. So I will refrain from doing that here. But in general, I think that the problem with legal journalism, with establishment legal journalism, reflects a lot of what's wrong with legal practice and legal culture more broadly, which is that most of the people who are most successful in legal journalism are steeped in a legal culture that treats judges and courts as special and different than everyone else, that treats them as apolitical, as different than everybody else just because they put on a robe and go to work. I think that the last several years especially have sort of laid bare the hilariously fraudulent nature of that lie. But it is still the kind of thing that persists, and every couple of weeks I read something that I get angry enough to tweet about. So
just every few weeks.
So I can only say what Jay said less eloquently. Obviously, huge problem that so many legal journalists still treat justices like oracles who have some kind of divine right to say what the Constitution means. I also think a lot of legal journalists don't trust their audiences to understand complicated legal issues that can be explained to people without JDs. It just requires a kind of understanding of how you explain this stuff to people without the background. And that's a skill that I fear some legal journalists never fully develop. And I also think there's a real problem with access journalism, where there are a lot of members of the Supreme Court press corps who curry favor with certain justices, who meet with them off the record, who flatter them, who go to lunch with them, and in exchange sort of pull their punches when covering them, and thereby mislead readers into thinking that these are people of true integrity and principle when they are very much not that.
Yeah, definitely agree with everything that was just said. I mean, not a ton to add, except that I think there's also like a hesitation in legal media, in legal journalists to, which is it's kind of an extension of law school, right? And what you're taught in law school, that the cases are, Supreme Court cases are justices saying what the law is, and that's kind of the end of that's the end of the inquiry, right? So I don't think that legal journalists really view themselves as sort of questioning the results that justices get to, questioning the methodology, the ideology that is used to get to those legal results. And so I think that leaves us with quite a superficial analysis of what's going on at the Supreme Court, because to the extent that they sort of were taught, that journalists were taught in our legal education institutions, right? Y'all know from class that there isn't a lot of built-in questioning of the process, questioning of ideology. It's really just taught, as like Jay and Mark both said, that like this is an organic process, and the Supreme Court justices are the referees who say what the law is, and then that's kind of the end of the inquiry. Yeah, I'll say that. I and agree with everything else that Jay and Mark said for sure.
You guys are describing this tendency to view these judges with this cloak of legitimacy or infallibility about whatever it is they're doing. But I'm interested to hear what you guys think the real life consequences are of that status quo in the mainstream media outlets.
I think something like overturning Roe v. Wade is a surprise to a lot of people when a legal media and legal journalists who were really contending with the reality of what was happening on the court would have prepared the wider public and an audience and a class of sort of activated political people on an issue that a lot of other people could maybe see coming, but those messages weren't reaching a wider audience, weren't reaching law students and even law professors, right? So I think like the big pitfall of this kind of media culture, journalism culture around the Supreme Court, the big pitfall, the big drawback of this is that you don't have an informed public about what's going on and how the law is made and interpreted.
Yeah.
Taking another shot at copying the previous panelist, but less eloquently. I think like there's a kind of domino effect here. The problem is that the media does bad legal reporting. The people who trust the media and believe that what it's saying is true are much more likely to be Democrats and liberals. And that leads Democrats and liberals to not be in on the joke when it comes to the courts. Like Republicans have been in on the joke forever, for so long. Like they are really, really good at pretending to think that the courts are these apolitical, neutral arbiters of justice, but organizing and voting like the courts are a political tool to be used to further their own agenda. And like they were kind of promoting the whole neutral arbiters myth while acting as though, the courts were going to be the key to them locking in a kind of counter-majoritarian rule as they lost popular support. And I think this cashes out, especially when it comes to state courts. And we're on the eve of the Wisconsin State Supreme Court election. I hope any Wisconsinites in the audience have voted absentee already. If not, you're screwed. It's too late, sorry to say. But, just in 2019, there was a Wisconsin Supreme Court race where the Republican was like, I'm a freaking culture warrior. I'm going to go out there and make sure that abortion rights are crushed and union rights are crushed and women's rights are crushed and that everybody who is not a straight white male suffers. And Republicans were like, yes, that is what we want. We will go to the polls to support that because we enthusiastically want it. And the liberal candidate was like, oh, I'm this technocrat. I'm really smart. I'm going to be super fair. I'm going to be an umpire. And she lost because nobody knew what she stood for. And fast forward 4 years, it's quite remarkable to see almost the reverse in this Wisconsin Supreme Court race, where like the liberal candidate is out there talking about how strongly she supports abortion rights and union rights and all this stuff. And the conservative candidate is kind of hiding what he supports because he knows it's not as popular. And I actually think the media did a really good job reporting on the Wisconsin race. I think that reporting on state elections for the judiciary has improved a great deal, and this is a good example of it, but it improved way too late. And for some reason, the media is still treating federal courts very differently, probably because the judges aren't elected. And that is preserving the status quo where Democrats are disproportionately likely to be naive little sheep who think that the courts are mystical arbiters of whatever God wants the Constitution to mean.
Yeah, I'm going to work on something about this for this week at ballsandstrikes.org. Great website. You should check it out. But it is like hysterically funny. In some ways, I look at the Wisconsin Supreme Court race and think it's just like, for lack of a better term, the most honest judicial competition, whatever you want, in the country that we've seen. It's so funny, the distinction between like this kabuki dance that we do every time there's a Supreme Court nomination about how both sides are just like faithful to the, jurists are just faithful to the Constitution and just calling balls and strikes. And then in Wisconsin, it's like it's like the grimiest congressional race between this like absolute fucking freak who's sending out like Republican campaign slogans, right, for his to be elected to the highest court. And I mean, I understand that like a lot of lawyers find that like grimy and distasteful and at odds with what they learned about the profession in law school, but I do think there's something sort of refreshing about seeing the veil lifted on that. Like real rights are at stake in Wisconsin and in other states um, where the highest courts have so much power. And I would rather the candidates address that openly and honestly than pretend they're not. And the other thing I wanted to say that Rhiannon's comment reminded me of about the media's sort of failure to warn people about the stakes of the end of Roe. I kind of feel the same way about the looming end of affirmative action, which is absolutely going to happen in the next like 3 months or so. Like it is unquestionably toast. And I feel like I've seen a lot of coverage of this that's like, if affirmative action falls, what will come next? Or how could schools possibly deal with this? And I would love, more coverage of this issue that does not have a question mark at the end of it, that talks about how this is going to be a sea change in how higher education works. And this is a question not of if, but of just like how soon and how it is going to change the composition of student bodies like for generations. I would like to see the media learn the lessons of Roe for that, and I don't feel like I've seen that so far.
Well, and in that same vein, you have spoken in the last few minutes about all these really consequential decisions in a row, right? We have Wisconsin is a really consequential story. Dobbs was a really consequential story. Affirmative action, and at a certain point, do you worry about if we're always raising the alarm? How do you address the public in an honest way that the alarm ringing doesn't become mundane or the norm? Because over the last few years, we've just seen every decision has potentially dire stakes. And how do you think, as sort of ethical journalists covering this, how do you think about covering the consequences authentically?
I mean, if the building's still on fire, like I don't want to turn down the volume on the siren, right?
Right. Like I think, you all sort of experienced as young people a Trump presidency, right? There's no reason to tamp down on sounding the alarm on the many myriad ways that Trump, was sort of attacking groups left and right, but also sort of, breaking apart, any semblance of sort of social justice momentum in terms of the law, right? I'm thinking about the immigration lawyer friends that I know, right? And so I think an ethical at least. So I have to say something. I do not identify as a journalist. I don't know what the ethics code is for journalists, and so I certainly don't abide by that. But on the podcast, when I'm talking about the law, when I'm talking about the Supreme Court, all of this stuff, like I do think that we try to prioritize doing right by our listeners, and doing right, I think, is telling the truth about what's going on. The question about like, is this mundane? They've normalized it. This is the normal, right? And that's what we're trying to say, is that like we live in this to some extent new-ish normal. This is what's happening, but you also have to frame it honestly in terms of movements. This was a movement that took concerted effort. It took money. It took ideology. It took sort of very explicit goals and consolidation and agreement around those goals, and a few decades of political real political work to make it our new normal, right? And so I think being honest about that, being honest that it is political, that it took a movement to make it happen, also then sort of illuminates a possible future where there can be a counter movement. It's possible that the pendulum swings the other way when we are real about how that happened.
I will say I do not really sense reader exhaustion when it comes to depressing stories about how the Supreme Court is bad. And I think one of the reasons why is because the Supreme Court is just a freaking content machine. Like, say what you will about the justices, but they never stop posting. And so it's like week in, week out, you're getting these awful opinions, like terrible orders, like shadow docket garbage. And there's just almost always something to write about. And I think that something that I and my co-panelists try to do is call attention to some of the cases that maybe don't get as much press, but that are still catastrophically bad. I mean, that's one of 5-4's greatest traits, I think. And something that legal journalists like Jay and I can work on, because we have the luxury of a little bit more time to sort of figure out, like, what do we want to lift up? Do we really want to write the 30th recap of these arguments, or do we want to find this cert petition that the conservatives refused to take up that involved the police like torturing a homeless man, and use that as an entry point to talk about how disgusting the Supreme Court's qualified immunity jurisprudence is, which is sadly a real example. And so I think that like that is a way to keep people from getting numbed to the horrors of the Supreme Court. I don't think that people have lost their interest in the court being very, very, very bad, but it is incumbent upon us to explain in detail and in a coherent way that non-JDs could understand, like all of the range of horrors and not just the narrow sliver of blockbuster cases that, while certainly the stuff of nightmares, I can attest, they are not going to benefit as much from our focus as a smaller or mid-level case that may do just as much harm.
To that point, I'm interested how you guys think about excavating the human stories that's at the heart of a lot of these cases while not getting bogged down in a lot of the legal analysis and precedent. What's your process for making sure that the real human consequences are at the foreground of your writing and your advocacy?
When I'm writing about a case, or when I've got someone at Balls and Strikes writing about a case, and I'm just going to assume for purposes of this answer that like the less power marginalized person takes a bath, probably 6-3, right? I start with the lower court opinions, with the briefs. There's a lot of information about the real people whose lives and livelihoods and rights are at stakes in these cases that sort of gets stripped away by virtue of the appellate process. You know, the Supreme Court frames its work as, answering narrow technical questions, right? Questions of law. And as such, the sequence of real world events that led the two sides to be before the justices, it's sort of ancillary at the margins. And I do my best to try and center both the people whose cases are being decided and then also the similarly situated people whose rights will be affected by that outcome. I also wanted to briefly mention that Rhiannon's point about the Trump administration media environment, like, you guys remember 2017, right? When like every other week it was Van Jones, like, today is the day Trump became president. Like, the media really struggled at first to cover sort of the capture of this institution that they venerated by someone who clearly did not share their perspective on how venerable the institution is. But eventually they caught up, right? To the point where when there was like a violent insurrection, the media was, by and large, willing to call it that. And I really would like to see legal journalists make sort of have the same transformation. Your question earlier about honesty, like if you're a journalist who cares about like giving people useful and honest information about what their government's doing. My view is that you should be as skeptical of everything that a conservative Supreme Court justice, any Supreme Court justice, frankly, but especially the conservatives right now, you should be as skeptical about anything they say as anything that comes out of Donald Trump's mouth. Like, this conservative supermajority is more powerful than Trump. He got voted out of office. They can't be. They're going to be around like for a generation, multiple generations. They're the locus of right-wing power in this country. And I don't think it's too much to ask for journalists to cover this as the existential crisis it is, instead of just like, nonpartisan lawyers beep booping into their Westlaw machine and coming out with the right answer.
Telling the human story behind a case is a very powerful tool. The bad guys understand that fact, and they are using that tool to their own advantage. Exhibit A, 303 Creative, a case this term about a website designer who has not been asked to make a wedding website for a same-sex couple, but who preemptively went to court, represented by Alliance Defending Freedom, and secured is going to secure a ruling that gives her the right to discriminate against same-sex couples and basically undermines or invalidates a bunch of civil rights laws in the process. What ADF did there was use the power of this human story that they basically made up and secure a huge amount of super favorable press coverage for their plaintiff. Go look at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. All of the main outlets ran these soft focus, glossy, super sensitive profiles of this woman who is asking for a license to discriminate and allowing herself to be used as a plaintiff to take down civil rights laws. And I fear that that shows that it is not always good to focus on the person behind the case, and that it's something that journalists need to think very carefully about, because we're at a stage where organizations like ADF are building entire cases around their ability to present a compelling and relatable plaintiff to use to hurt or destroy many, many people's lives. So I just kind of wanted to push back on the idea that it's always good to focus on the person. Like, sometimes the person is essentially a sock puppet for a very evil agenda. And the fact that you can manipulate the facts in their story to make them sound very sympathetic is not something that the press should be buying into. And it's a massive failure that the press did in this instance.
You talked about the Sacketts that way also. I think they were similarly couched that way.
Yeah. I mean, wealthy landowners who wanted to fill in basically an environmentally sensitive area on the periphery of their property. And they were framed by Pacific Legal Foundation as these sweet, humble, kind, gentle, salt of the earth, modest people who just wanted to, exercise their rights. And the media bought into that, and it really fucking sucked.
Another example, I think, right off the top of my head is the Brackeens, right? In Brackeen v. Holland, an upcoming case this term on ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. The Brackeen family, this couple is the white couple who have adopted a native child. And media coverage about that is sort of everything you would expect, right? About sort of the stereotypical, this is a white savior family.
What role do you think the subject matter experts we have in the legal profession play in keeping this problem of milquetoast moderate journalism entrenched as it is? Jay, I know you're smiling. I'm giving you the softball for your favorite take on Harvard Law's Bloomberg columnist. So I know you guys know where I'm heading with this. I would love to hear what role you think these people should be playing in the discourse concerning these cases where the human stakes are really, really at a fever pitch.
I'm so sorry, I missed it. I'm sorry, I just missed the beginning of the question. Which people playing the role?
Subject matter experts like
Got it.
law professors,
Yeah.
former clerks, former prosecutors.
Thank you.
We're yelling about Noah Feldman. I'll go first. We'll all take a turn.
This is a tag team thing, I believe.
Hell
Yeah.
yeah.
Sing the
Jay
song,
just
I'll hum the tune.
put up
Yeah.
First of all, I do want to clarify. Yeah, I do not endorse soft brushed portraits of sock puppets. Stick around later, and I'll tell you though about the persecution of a high school coach who just wanted to say some prayers. Yeah, I think the role that experts, that sort of the academic credentialed experts should play in our discourse is less. But there's a good reason why it's persisted, right? If you are, let's say you're not like a full-time legal commentator, legal journalist, but you are writing about something the Supreme Court did. Like you are probably taught in journalism school. I wouldn't know, I didn't go. But like, it makes a lot of sense, right? To call a law school, to talk to a law professor, and to get some comment from them, to have them help you explain a case through. And then as far as like, journalists who are lawyers, who are on the full-time beat, like there's a certain amount of self-preservation involved in how the profession works. Like it's the idea that justices do law, not politics, is extremely useful if you are paid a lot of money to explain like why this famously opaque institution is, again, special and different from politics. And so it's a lot more interesting and fun for you to hypothesize about the formation of some unlikely moderate block of justices in a case, right? Than it is to, sort of as Mark said earlier, to unfortunately have to write the same story again, which is that the marginalized, less powerful people lost 6-3. I do also, I'm going to let my other panelists talk, but I do want to reiterate my occasional call, which is, and I'm dead serious about this, if any of you know how much Noah Feldman gets paid to write his Bloomberg columns, legally you have to tell me. My DMs are open, you can find my email. I want to know so badly. So again, like, please get in touch if you know. Thanks.
Mark, do you have insight into this? Do you have any sense of salaries in this space?
I mean, if you were representing a cancer-causing corporation, I could give you his hourly rates, but I don't know about Bloomberg in particular.
No one's here, no one's watching this, right? Like, I have heard a couple people like float possible numbers that are fucking insane, and it just makes me want to know even more badly. So again, please do the Lord's work. Thanks.
Yeah, just on the subject of subject matter experts, I think it's right that like some of these people, actually a lot of people, are like worth talking to get input on some of this stuff, right? In my preparation for the podcast on certain cases, I have contacted subject matter experts, right? I have contacted my own professors from when I was in law school, other law professors, people who have written the scholarly articles that I am reading about these cases. Their input is not completely irrelevant, right? And their input isn't like across the board stupid. I think that it just has to be used, that input that you get still has to go through an intellectual processing machine so that the output is not exactly what they've told you, right? In the same way that you get the input into the intellectual machine from the Supreme Court, from the justices, and you're not just regurgitating what they're saying, right? So it all has to be interpreted within the context. I want to see journalists, sort of inspecting, investigating motivations, moneyed interests, biases, all of that come from subject matter experts too. Like, I think it's the same sort of critical inquiry and critical reasoning that should be used. And yeah, I think it, like, I think Noah Feldman's a great example of sort of belies the problems with with the creation of this kind of industry, right? Of Supreme Court experts, of Supreme Court case experts, that kind of thing, where people are getting paid to be extremely knowledgeable about a topic where they are best rewarded in that kind of career by being deferential to the institution, right? Holding it up on a pedestal. So there are problems in that kind of economy, certainly, but in terms of like, using some of these people as a reference, as a starting point, as to answer questions a little bit about a legal landscape you're unsure about, like there's value in that, certainly.
So briefly, the fact that Josh Blackman is still regularly quoted as a subject matter expert in anything in mainstream media outlets suggests to me that we need at least a 10-year moratorium on quoting law professors in media until we can figure out what's going on. It is really painfully obvious that if you are a journalist, you can always find a law professor who will say whatever perspective you need in that particular section of your story. This professor says X, this other professor says Y. That is not helpful at all. I don't think it's helpful for the journalist. I don't think it's helpful for readers. I don't think it's good. I think it's, in fact, quite bad. I will say that the way that I tend to rely on law professors is that when there is a topic I need to understand and don't really have a strong grasp on or background knowledge in, I will try to figure out who is a law professor who has true expertise, who has written law review articles about this, who has been in the archives doing the work, doing the research, who's given symposia, talks, whatever. And I will read their work, but also I will get them on the phone and I will make them teach me what they know about this area of law. And frankly, I think it's like one of the best parts of my job because I get to force these very smart people to teach me stuff for free. And like, I might not even end up quoting them in my piece. And I tell them that up front. I'm like, look, you might not have any like quotes in this article. I want to understand this, and I think you're going to be able to help. And so for me, it's not that a law professor can provide some kind of authoritative voice. It's that they can help me digest like the very complicated legal and sometimes factual issues and present them to an audience in a way that everybody hopefully can understand. And I think, I'm biased here, but I do think that is a better use of a law professor's expertise than just plugging in their quotes because your article requires an opposing view of a particular part of the story.
Perhaps not to the same degree as the Noah Feldmans of the world, but as law school graduates yourself, and as many of us are going to be soon, you're kind of endowed with this presumptive intellectual credibility as you're talking about the law and politics in American society. And I'm wondering how you guys specifically go about wielding that in a thoughtful, modest way. Maybe some pointers for us as we go out into the world and are trusted way more than we should.
I don't. Next question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think modesty is an interesting concept. I don't go on the podcast and like talk about this stuff necessarily to be modest, right? I think that my voice, the voices of people in the classroom with you right now, the voices of people on this panel are important and should be heard on things, right? To the extent that I'm asked or ever need to talk about something that I don't know anything about, I think that's the responsibility to just be upfront about that, right? Like Mark just said, when he doesn't know something, that's something I need to learn about, right? Before I'm speaking authoritatively on it. I think like an example is like, I've been very upfront on the podcast. I don't know shit about the First Amendment. I don't really care to know any more about the First Amendment. I know so many things and I don't want to know anything about the First Amendment, to be honest. So I don't talk authoritatively on the First Amendment, right? I don't answer questions about it. And if I need to learn like some discrete thing or what's going on in a case, then I do that, right? But in general, sort of a I think people with our viewpoint, people who are proposing critique about the way things are talked about now, about the way the law is treated, about the way the Supreme Court is treated, I'm not sure that prioritizing our modesty is something that I feel super strongly about right now.
I mean, the other side doesn't worry about this, right? Like the other side is like, we're brain geniuses. We're the smartest guys in the room. Like everything we say is the divine truth and you should always believe and trust us. Like they don't have imposter syndrome. They don't have any concerns about modesty. Like they are out there just saying, you should believe me when I tell you that the Voting Rights Act is racist. And I do think that's something that we should think about and maybe interpret as a sign that modesty, while certainly an important personal value, is not always appropriate. And you know, I'm speaking here as a legal journalist. It's obviously different if you're a practicing lawyer, but like for those of you who want to do legal journalism or even dip your toes in, or just speak publicly about this kind of stuff, just remember that the people who are saying the opposite thing are not prefacing their comments by saying, oh, I'm not 100% an expert. You know, I haven't spent years in the archives. They are just going for it. And I think if you have developed a particular expertise, if you have read all there is to read, if you have talked to the experts, you should go out there and speak very confidently and not let any kind of doubt undermine you just because you're not the world's preeminent expert. You are an expert enough. You can speak about it lucidly, and you should do that because you have every right to.
Yeah, like the thought that comes to my mind when I think about modesty is like, modesty compared to what or to whom? Like compared to Ed Whalen, like I'm good. Like I'll put my analysis up there with his, right? And Lord willing, it's at least as cogent and non-defamatory as his. Like I do think, sort of to Rhiannon's point, like if I'm ever doing an interview, you know, about what's going on at the Supreme Court and someone asks me about a case that I don't know anything about, like I'll just say that, right? Like, hey, I haven't followed that case super closely. I can't really add anything useful. You know, let's talk about something else, which is perfectly fine. And like, in my view, the least I should be doing in that situation. But like if I'm working, for example, with someone who's writing for Balls and Strikes, and I see this a lot with law students who are writers and young lawyers who will sort of like couch a lot of their writing with caveats like those that we're talking about. And I always try and take the time to tell them like, hey, no, like you've done the work here. You've made the argument. You've drawn a fair conclusion from the argument. You don't like, you can say it with your full chest. Like as my co-panelists have said, like nobody else on the other side is doing it, is saying it with anything less. But like any sort of like performative modesty, it's like modesty in like legal journalism on the left, like isn't going to get people of color their voting rights back. It's not going to get pregnant people their rights to bodily autonomy back. Watering down what we have to say, our perspective on the courts, is only going to do harm to people who are already the most harmed by the legal system. And I don't particularly have time for it.
Just one more thing to add, you know, something I learned by being a public defender and really focusing and sort of honing skills in client-centered representation is that the clients are the expert on their lives, right? So expertise, I think, is really relative, and the expertise we should be valuing when we're learning about cases, the expertise that we should be prioritizing is the expertise of people who experience these laws, right? Experience the life it is to live under these oppressive systems that the Supreme Court continues to uphold, right? So I'm not, you know, my approach would not be to counsel modesty on those people when that's the expertise I think that actually should be sort of held up and a light shown on, right? So in the same way, our expertise in telling those stories, making sure those narratives are told, prioritizing those views. Yeah, I'm not going to be modest about it.
before we take questions from the audience, we just have one final question for you guys, which is whether there's any recent trends in legal journalism reporting that make you hopeful for what's coming.
Can I interest anybody in a podcast called 5 to 4? It's about how the Supreme Court sucks. Yeah. Really liking what those guys are doing.
I mean, like, yes, the democratization of legal journalism is really great. And it's something that has only come about in the last 4 or 5 years. Podcasts have played a big role, but that's not the whole story. There are also wonderful websites like Balls and Strikes that are in part a result of progressive movers and shakers understanding that it is important to have these voices and arguments out there in the world, something that, again, the other side understood 50 years ago, but better late than never. And I think the quality of legal journalism has gotten better because of wonderful outlets like Balls and Strikes and podcasts like 5-4. I think the competition has had an impact on some of the big dogs. Like, again, I'm not going to sit here and praise all of the New York Times coverage, but I do sense that there is more realism in some of the coverage of the Supreme Court especially. And I think part of that is like they feel the fire at their feet and they understand that a lot of New York Times readers are also listening to 5-4 or reading Balls and Strikes. And they're like, Adam Liptak, I love you, but like, this is bullshit. These people are politicians in robes. That is a really good thing. That is a wonderful effect. And it definitely makes me optimistic about the future of legal journalism.
Yeah, I was thinking about a question that Rhiannon asked me not long ago, which was, how did I get radicalized? And I was thinking about it sort of in the context of like my accidental journalism career. Like I was a practicing lawyer who was pretty unhappy and really wanted to write on the internet, but didn't know how to go about that. And like, as I got into journalism, as I left the practice of law, I would occasionally write about legal issues, but like it was really hard to do so, especially if you're not like in Washington, D.C., possessing a hard pass, going to the court to hear oral argument in person, like until like the last couple of years, like that was the only way that you could cover oral argument like the same day. The live streaming of oral argument, right, allows people like me, I live in Seattle, Rhiannon I know is in Texas, people who live far away for whom the court is not a convenient to commute to cover it the same as anyone else in real time. I think that's had a huge impact on the tenor of Supreme Court coverage. As Mark says, like the sort of more traditional establishment legal journalists, like they read everything that's written about them too, and they read everything else that's written about the court. And when they see criticism of their approaches, when they see other outlets, prominent voices specifically taking an alternative angle, they're going to think about that as they do their work. So I do think that like things are getting better, and I plan to continue to tweet until they are perfect.
Yeah, nothing to add. We can get to questions. Just agree with everything.
Yeah.
Getting a little bit better.
Sure. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hey guys, thanks for being here. Just sort of based off that last answer, I'm curious if you think we'll actually get to a point where like oral arguments will be live streamed with video too, and if you think that would be positive or could have drawbacks.
Would be great, never going to happen.
Yeah,
But
I don't
think that's
there's
it.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of there's not a lot of push for it, right? Like they're certainly not going to do it if nobody's asking for it. And I don't think like a ton of people are really asking for that. In general, I think the making that stuff available to the public as much as possible is in general a good thing for sure. But yeah, I don't know that there's any pressure at all right now for that to happen. So highly unlikely.
They're both correct.
We have another question.
So based on your commentary, I'm curious what you guys think the kind of like the Fox News side of legal journalism, if it even exists, if you can even like legally call it legal journalism. How do we effectively combat that side of the narrative while they're just like going off the rails completely?
Yeah, I mean, you just have to keep doing what you're doing, right? Like that it is they're going off the rails completely, and Sam Alito is going off the rails completely, and those two institutions, if you will, are talking to each other constantly, right? Sam Alito is a consumer of that media. Fox News is a consumer of Sam Alito's legal output and supporter, right? And so again, I think framing it and understanding it in terms of movements, in terms of institutions working in conjunction with one another, right? And that what we do on our side is lift the veil, continue to critique, build counter movements. I think that's what you have to do.
Yeah, if like part of the problem with conservative media, and especially conservative legal media, is that there's so much of it. And if I made it my mission to like show how fucking brain dead every post from Ed Whalen and the baseball crank is, like that would be probably multiple full-time jobs. That would take up 100% of my energy, of my time, and I would never be able to write anything else. Like that shit is by and large there to distract you. And I think one thing that I think about a lot at Balls and Strikes in my work in general is like, what if I'm responding to something from the other side of the ideological spectrum? Is this just like fisking something for the sake of fisking it, or is there like a broader point about law and politics or legal culture that I can make? And if it's something that's just like there to take up oxygen, I think it's really important to sort of pick and choose your spots.
Yeah, another question.
Hi guys, thank you so much for doing this. I'm a big fan of all three of you. I'm wondering if you guys have any advice for people in the room who might be interested in getting involved in progressive legal journalism, either on the side or as a future career.
You should pitch to Jay Willis. I hear he's a really great editor, and he's looking for writers. You can also pitch to Slate. You can pitch to a bunch of great outlets that are publishing good legal journalism right now. Again, I think that there's never been more progressive or left-leaning outlets that are eager to publish that kind of stuff. But in terms of like how you get to that point, I think you really need to practice writing a lot, and writing in the style that is necessary for this particular job, writing about complicated legal issues for a general audience. It is easier said than done. It is a skill that you have to develop. And I think that it is one that law school perversely attempts to drill out of you. And so if you are in law school right now, it is very important to, I think, try to not allow it to be drilled out of you, and to think about how you would explain various cases and legal issues to an audience, and even potentially write like a draft article. Maybe you're not going to place it anywhere, maybe you will, but it's really important to get that practice in and develop that kind of thinking to writing process where you're comfortable with it and you can do it for a bigger audience and you can do it quickly.
A great plug for the flaw. So one last question we have time for.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak today. My question is about, thinking about if you were back in law school, what would you do to try to get this narrative out that, the Supreme Court they're all politicians in robes, beyond just listening to 5-4 and reading Balls and Strikes and Slate, which I tell everybody to do. But if you're in my shoes, if you're a 1L, how are you getting this out to try to convince people that are taking classes where you don't hear this viewpoint very frequently, if at all, especially in the Black letter classes. Obviously, you hear it in Professor Hanson's class, but you don't hear it in many other classes. So how do you try to, impart this to people who are going to, be the next generation of judges and lawyers at the big firms and such?
Yeah, I think my advice is really just encouragement to use your voice, and it's kind of a fake it till you make it thing. I am, whether I believe that or not, right? I am telling myself all the time that my voice is important. I'm telling you, and you can believe me, that your voice in class is important. The racists in your class have no problem saying, I think people should get over racism, right? When you're talking about an affirmative action case, you should have no problem saying, this Scalia decision rubs me the wrong way and is racist for XYZ reasons, right? What we're learning right now feels like we are, hiding behind the veil of something deeply political. What I actually know about this case is this really wealthy oil company was behind this litigation. So you just saying those things, right, is incredibly important. Your voice is important, and you should be using it in all of the spaces that you are in, right? And just, again, the way the other side is doing it all the time and feels free to do so all the time.
Okay, that's a great place to leave it. Thank you for that message to finish us. That's perfect. Can we have a big round of applause for our panelists? Thank you all so much again. We are so lucky to have you. Really grateful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.